everybody. Great to have you with us for Crossroads Politics here on WTHR+. I'm Dustin Grove. That is a wrap. After about 3 months, this year's legislative session is now over. So we're going to be covering all the big bills, what passed, what did not, and what it means to you. Capitol Chronicle editor Nikki Kelly is here to help with that. But let's start with our 13 News State House reporter Emily Longnecker at the State House to break down one of the most contentious issues all session, really, which was immigration. And Emily, it wasn't just one bill that touched on this topic.
No, Dustin, it touched on several bills, and really immigration was at the center of some of the biggest and contentious debates this legislative session. Senate Bill 1, the Senate's big priority for the session, focused on restricting welfare access. One way it did that was by focusing on Republican claims that undocumented people were using those programs. Democrats said there was no evidence of that was a problem. Even more contentious was a bill requiring all local governments to cooperate with immigration enforcement. Indiana police are already required to help federal immigration agents, but Senate Bill 76 would extend that to city and town governments and even schools.
Why are we in a hurry to put every level of government at the disposal of this agency? With their track record, open your eyes.
And both of these bills passed this session. And of course, all of this happened against the background of that immigration crackdown in Minneapolis that saw 2 U.S. citizens shot and killed by federal immigration agents and a growing number of immigration detainees here in Indiana prisons and jails. Dustin?
Emily. All right, Emily, thank you. We'll check back here in just a few minutes on some of the other bills, but I do want to bring Nikki in now. So immigration has obviously been a priority for the White House. But polling has turned against some of the president's policies, or at least the tactics.
Yeah.
Do you see this issue being an issue for voters when it comes to state politics this year? Because a lot of state lawmakers are on the ballot for the midterms.
Yeah, I don't really think so. I think in general, even those who are turning kind of against the Trump direction, they still want to control immigration. They just don't really like how ICE has been handling it and the tactics. But, I think if you ask them directly, should non-citizens be on, SNAP or Medicaid or get CDL licenses? I mean, I think that would all be pretty clearly a no, at least here in Indiana.
What's your takeaway on the immigration legislation this year?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a heavy hand, right? I mean, they're giving the Attorney General lots of authority to go after businesses, schools, local governments, and even when they don't do something on purpose or these unwritten, they even wrote in there, it doesn't even have to be a written policy against cooperation. It could just be an action of one person. So yeah, I mean, it's a pretty steep, strict bill.
We'll check back. Stay right there. Let's move now to another big issue for lawmakers this year, which was affordability. House Republicans, they took aim at 2 fronts on this issue. One of them was housing. But Emily, their big housing affordability bill saw some big changes before it finally crossed the finish line, didn't it?
Yeah, Dustin, we're talking about House Bill 1001, and it was meant to tackle housing costs by increasing supply. When it was introduced, it included many clauses meant to loosen regulations around building new housing. That included cutting some red tape around safety regulations and forcing communities to allow some multifamily housing in single-family zoned areas. But almost all the language in the bill was watered down after pushback from local governments. Many changes became voluntary. Local governments will need to submit housing reports, and lawmakers are forming a study committee. That bill did pass. Meanwhile, a bill to make street camping illegal also passed and is set to become law. Activists say it makes it a crime to be homeless.
One thing I can say that, being homeless does to you is it kind of dehumanizes you.
Over 95% of them are already engaged with a homeless service provider trying to get into housing.
The language around street camping was drafted by a think tank in Texas. The bill's supporters say that this is meant to connect the unhoused with services. There was a similar bill like this last year. It did not pass. This year, though, it got through. Dustin?
All right. Emily, thank you. So, Nikki, explain a little bit more to those who may not understand, because we keep hearing critics who say, well, this is criminalizing homelessness. It's going in the wrong direction. But supporters say, no, this is meant to connect them to services. So how does the bill actually do that? How does the law actually do that?
I mean, it puts a lot of discretion on the local police who would see the homeless people there. I mean, they can tell them about a shelter down the street, and if they have, beds, they can choose to go there, but it doesn't really put any money behind that effort. And again, like I said, it is a defense to the misdemeanor if there are no shelter beds available. So, I don't know if, like I said, there's not a lot of services wrapped into the bill. They certainly can offer up the few that there are. There are some communities in the state that have, different options, but a lot of them have no homeless options, to help with housing.
This affordability bill got a lot of pushback, as Emily said, in terms of housing, because you had, communities that said, okay, we want to reduce the red tape, but on the other hand, we still need rules, or anybody can put up anything anywhere. Did anything about how that bill ended surprise you?
I mean, basically, it was completely neutered. I mean, it started out as basically a preemption to local regulations, and it was obviously favoring quantity over quality, and local units said, hey, we don't want that. So now it lets them basically opt out of all that, and if they already have their own housing regulations, why wouldn't they do that again?
Yeah. Do you think that it might come back in another session? Or
Probably, yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right, stay tuned. Another issue when it comes to affordability is our utility bills. They have been going up. Lawmakers took a swing at those rising costs, specifically around our electricity bills. Emily, this is a big bill that also makes a lot of changes, huh?
A big bill, Dustin, and it's probably best to look at this as a bill with a lot of little tweaks in it. It was meant to help customers with high utility bills and slow down the rate of how fast those utility bills are rising. Indiana has had some of the fastest growing electricity bills in the country, and lawmakers have clearly been hearing about it from constituents. House Bill 1002 does too much for us to cover it all here, but here are some examples. It creates plans for customers who need assistance to spread their bills out over the year, and those plans can't be called budget plans unless they actually cost less. It also adds heat emergencies to the times when power companies cannot cut service. Right now, that only happens during the winter. It also has lots of tweaks to how Indiana regulates its power utilities, but not everyone was happy with this.
Especially if you're a low-income customer. If you have a large balance, a large arrearage, what happens to that arrearage? Do they have to pay that immediately? If so, from our perspective, we're going to exacerbate sort of unaffordability, increase disconnections, especially for vulnerable households.
The bill was signed by Governor Braun. While this bill was making its way through the General Assembly, the IURC was making its own moves. Andy Zay actually left the Senate. He was in the Senate. He left that to head the IURC and held a press conference about how utilities were going to start working to lower costs. Dustin?
All right, Emily, let's bring in Nikki again. I know you tweeted that was the first IURC press conference that you can remember at the State House. Now, I don't want to age you, but you are a seasoned veteran in the State House. That's saying something.
I am going to recorrect. I do remember one press conference when they ran out of, I think it was the IURC, when they ran out of phone numbers up in the top and we were choosing who would get to keep the 219.
Oh, and 574 or
yes,
260?
yes.
Yep.
And there was a press conference for that because they drew things out of a fishbowl to see who got to keep the 219. But otherwise,
that's how they did it.
That really is, yeah.
Wow.
But anyway, yeah, it's a big deal. They're clearly using the bully pulpit on this, which is, I think going to help a lot. The bill itself, I don't really think that they're going to do more on it next year because the big part of the bill changes rate making and it will do these performance based. So they'll have to, when they come in the future and say, I want a 3-year rate of this, they'll have to prove if they've worked on affordability, they'll have to prove reliability. How fast does it take to them to get your electricity back online after a big storm, that kind of stuff. So it puts performance in there. The problem for consumers dealing with high prices now is that's going to be years down the road.
Right. All right, we'll wait and see. Wait to measure that success there. Another big topic this year was education, from banning cell phones in school to changing the rules for Central Indiana's biggest school district. Emily, so how did that all shake out? Break it down for us.
Yeah, Dustin, a big year for education changes. That includes another priority House Bill 1003. That bill slashed a lot of rules and requirements for schools. Some of those cuts raised eyebrows. Our 13 Investigates team reported on this after one of those proposed cuts was an AED program that had just been added the year before. That was added back in, along with language protecting diabetic students. Even lawmakers were puzzled by the attempted change.
Actually super frustrating. It's a 178-page bill. And when you get to that section, it says repeal section 139. And that's it. And so there's not really information about what that is.
Lawmakers also passed a blanket ban on cell phones anywhere in school during the school day in Senate Bill 78. Previously, they were only banned during class time. And lawmakers also created a board to oversee school buildings for public and charter schools within IPS. According to this bill, House Bill 1423, it makes the Indianapolis mayor responsible for appointing the members of that board. Another bill, Senate Bill 88, reforms some testing and good citizenship education requirements. Notably, it requires citizenship classes to teach you that you need to graduate high school, get a full-time job, and wait until you're married to have children. Dustin?
All right, Emily. Nikki, if you had to write a headline for education legislation this session, what do you think it would be?
I mean, I think the cell phone bill was a big swing by lawmakers and could honestly have a big difference. There's always a ton of education bills, right? It's nearly half of the state budget. So never surprised by the amount of education. But I think the cell phone bill was a big swing. I think the Indianapolis governance is interesting to watch because that might be spread to other districts in the state.
Okay. Stay right there. You stay right there. We're just getting started on our overview of this year's legislative session. Up next, we're going to be looking at the bill lawmakers passed hoping to attract the Chicago Bears to Northwest Indiana and where it stands right now. And this session started with a redistricting push. Remember that? Back in December? It seems like an eternity ago. How the failure here fits into the national redistricting battle. But first,
we are in the midst of the greatest crisis of our time.
some of the most emotional testimony of the session, from Haley's Law to tackling teens with guns, how lawmakers handled crime this session. That's next here on Crossroads Politics. Welcome back to Crossroads Politics. As we continue to review last year's legislative session, this year's legislative session that just ended, we want to turn now to criminal justice, where lawmakers focused on reforming some definitions and responsibilities. Right, Emily?
Yeah, lawmakers tweaked Indiana's criminal code this year, focusing on crimes involving children and violent crime in general. House Bill 1258 refines the definition of a crime of violence and increases the possible penalties for someone who is repeatedly convicted for dangerous possession of a firearm. House Bill 1249 also tweaks how Indiana's court system treats juveniles who are charged with dangerous possession of a firearm. Right now, a child charged with that crime is automatically waived to adult court, but under House Bill 1249, they could stay in juvenile court if it's the only crime they are facing and they have no prior criminal history. If not, they go to adult court.
At this point, our law makes it so that these kids aren't afraid of going to juvenile court if they're carrying around a gun. What we're trying to do is, don't stop in juvenile court and pass go. You go straight to adult court.
Again, before the bill's passage, the child had to go to adult court. The bill also increases penalties for kids who bring guns on or near schools or on a school bus. Senate Bill 160, meanwhile, lets prosecutors seek harsher sentences if someone wears a mask while committing a crime. Dustin?
All right, Emily, thank you. So, Nikki, lawmakers have heard for years concerns from the police union in particular about repeat offenders and juvenile crime. It seems like lawmakers really took up that issue this session.
Yeah, the juvenile crime issue is tough because you want to, some of them are 13, 14 years old. You can't throw the book at them immediately, right? You got to give them a chance to learn what they did wrong, but it is a continual problem in the state. And so they've sort of picked a few here and there to focus on. Definitely gun charges were the top one.
So another bill, maybe not directly about crime, also got a lot of attention. House Bill 1033 would let the governor and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court make some direct appointments to the board overseeing judges in Marion County here in Indianapolis. Why is this generating so much concern from some Indianapolis lawyers?
I mean, I think the concern is that, Indianapolis is getting treated differently, right? And that there's a bunch of Republican lawmakers who don't like some of the judges and the prosecutor, and this is just another way for them to control a process, and this time through the governor.
Yep. A Republican supermajority of state leaders, and Indianapolis, of course, being a Democratic stronghold in the state. All right, toward the end of the session, the shocking death of 17-year-old Haley Busby spurred lawmakers to action. A petition by her parents called for a Haley's Law, and Emily, lawmakers were pretty quick to respond.
Yeah, they were, Dustin, and it was very emotional testimony from Haley's family here at the State House, leading to lawmakers introducing amendments to make this happen. Both parts of Haley's Law that were introduced made it through, though one got through easier than the other. Expanding Indiana's alert system was the easy part. The bill adds missing children to the people who can be the subject of a silver alert. Before, they needed to be missing and endangered. That passed in House Bill 1303. It was a key part of the plea from Haley's parents when they spoke to lawmakers in the wake of her death.
We are in the midst of the greatest crisis of our time. We are losing the fight to protect our children. The internet and social media are the devil's and predators' playgrounds.
The second piece was restricting social media access for teens. This was originally in Senate Bill 199, even before we learned of Haley's death. The Senate took it out, the House added it back in, but then the language was taken out again in conference committee. It wound up in another bill, House Bill 1408, which passed with unanimous approval on the last day of session, but lawmakers have also said they will continue looking at this issue and proposing reforms. Dustin?
All right, Emily. Nikki, the social media restrictions, that whole conversation is so sticky because it involves First Amendment rights.
Exactly. And what they came up with puts a lot of the onus on the companies, whether it be Meta or Instagram or, Snapchat, although I don't technically think Snapchat is covered. They're going to have to create a lot of new systems specifically for Indiana's law. And I can't imagine that it's not going to get challenged in court.
We know some parts of the Haley's Law petition were not introduced this session. Lawmakers have also said they're going to keep looking into the state's Amber Alert system. So do you expect them to come back with an updated proposal next year, or is this kind of a wait and see?
I do think they need to focus back on that alert system. By putting it in the Silver Alert, I don't know. It seems like it doesn't really go. People understand the Amber Alert to be children. They understand the Silver Alert to be elderly, and so I don't know. They're either going to have to re-educate the entire populace or figure out a way to get that in the Amber Alert program.
Well, one of the biggest talkers of this legislative session was another late addition. In late January, lawmakers put in language that would create a new stadium authority. This is in a bid to attract the Chicago Bears to Indiana. And Emily, this came together pretty quickly.
Yeah, Dustin, it took just over 1 month from this stadium authority being introduced in legislation and the governor signing it actually into law. Senate Bill 27 started life as a vehicle bill. That means it's just an empty piece of legislation that lawmakers can change if they need to do something after the deadline for new bills have passed. And they did just that, amending it on January 22nd to create the Northwest Indiana Stadium Authority. SB 27 doesn't say which NFL team would move into the stadium, but the Chicago Bears have acknowledged they are in talks and considering a location in Hammond. There was speculation that the move was meant to spite Illinois and its governor, J.B. Pritzker, who is a potential presidential candidate for the Democrats in 2028. But Governor Braun went on ESPN's Pat McAfee show to say it was all the Bears' idea.
They came to us. We didn't try to lure them because they thought there was no interest, and they were being told bluntly, you got to build your own stadium.
Now, the Bears have not committed to this move, and Illinois is currently drafting its own legislation to try and keep the Bears in town there. And their session doesn't end, remember, for a couple months, but a lot of bipartisan support for getting this stadium to Hammond and bringing the Bears to Northwest Indiana. Just for example, it had 70 sponsors in the House. Dustin?
Yeah. A lot of interest over here, and now suddenly it's very interesting to hear lawmakers across the line in Illinois saying, okay, we're getting to it. So, Nikki, I know NFL stadium financing and negotiation isn't always part of your repertoire, but
this is the second time I'm doing it, so.
Well, that's true. The biggest question I get from people is this really going to happen? I mean, and it seems like lawmakers here, at least, have done their part to put their money where their mouth is.
They did, and they moved fast. They used the framework from the Indianapolis Colts Stadium. Now it's really in the court, and the ball is in the Bears' court, so to speak, although I'm mixing, obviously, sports. Now, the Bears already have bought land over there. Yeah. They obviously have a rich history over there. So I still think we have, a big thing to, surmount. But, we've done what we can, and they're going to have to make the decision. And I think Governor Braun has said a few times, he expects that to come in the next month or two.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We'll wait and see. I don't think they're going to change their names.
No,
not
at
Gary
all.
Bears, no Hammond Bears.
No Hammond
Still
eggs.
Chicagoland. Yeah. Okay. This session, lawmakers also made a push for justice for families that have waited far too long.
What can families do to pursue their own justice so they don't have to wait as long as we did?
How a new law will help solve cold cases here in Indiana. And the U.S. and Israel attack Iran, killing the Ayatollah and triggering retaliatory strikes across the Middle East. We'll tell you how it could impact Indiana. But first, how is redistricting playing out across the country? How the failure here fits into the national puzzle. Next on Crossroads Politics. Welcome back to Crossroads Politics. This whole legislative session started, if you remember, with the push for congressional redistricting. And Emily, that's one reason the session actually ended so early.
Right, Dustin, the special session that wasn't a special session that saw lawmakers back here in this building in December, and we were here too as they debated redistricting shortly after Organization Day, which is the technical start of the legislative session. So that moved the whole legislative session up to avoid extra expenses. As we know, Republicans were trying to draw a 9-0 map that would have replaced Indiana's 2 Democratic representatives with Republicans. Senate President Pro Tem Rod Bray warned the votes weren't there, but under pressure from President Trump, lawmakers moved forward with the push. The bill made it through the House, but was defeated in the Senate in an overwhelming vote. Because it happened during the regular session, there was no way to bring the bill back after its clear defeat. Governor Braun and Republicans have shown no interest in bringing redistricting back up. This was all part of a national redistricting push that we saw, and that has been mostly a draw. New maps in Texas and California have mostly canceled one another out. A push to redraw Maryland's districts to favor Democrats was blocked by that state's Senate president, defying his own party, much like we saw Rod Bray do here. Dustin?
All right, Emily, thank you. Nikki, it seems like if you listened to Rod Bray in the very beginning, he said, we don't have the votes. And then we went through the whole process to not have the votes. Was this an attempt, you think, just to get lawmakers on the record for who was voting yes and no?
I think the White House probably thought they could push them, and I don't blame them for thinking that. This is a super majority in both chambers for Republicans, so I think they thought if they put the pressure on that enough of them would come around, but it just didn't happen. In fact, it backfired.
And the president and Governor Braun, the lieutenant governor also talked about retribution. There would be consequences for those who do not support it, backing primary challenges, and we could see that play out this year, right?
Yeah, we have a number of challengers already to the Senate Republicans who voted no. Although I found it interesting, one of them that Trump endorsed, a city councilman up in Bluffton, he's already pulled out of the race, even though his name will remain on the ballot, because he said, look, I can't do it. This is too big of a district and there's no support. He's like, I just can't do it. So
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Redistricting wasn't the only failure of this legislative session. As our coverage continues, we're going to be looking at the misses. From healthcare costs to marijuana and data centers. We'll tell you what lawmakers did not get done. But first.
A vote for this is a vote against the competence and independence of your local law enforcement. And their choice, if the governor sends the military police in, will be to step aside.
Governor Braun will soon be able to deploy military police anywhere in Indiana. The fight over the new law next. Welcome back to our end of session recap here on Crossroads Politics. You know, among the most controversial bills in this legislative session would probably have to be a bill creating a military police force in the National Guard. Emily, this faced very loud opposition from Democrats in particular.
Yeah, Dustin, like the immigration bills that we mentioned in the first half of this program, this bill was constantly in the shadow of the immigration crackdown in Minnesota, and Democratic opponents to this bill constantly reference that. House Bill 1343 covered a lot of public safety topics, but the one that got the most attention had to do with the Indiana National Guard. It allowed any guardsman with law enforcement training to join an Indiana National Guard military police force. It would also let the governor deploy that military force anywhere in the state.
A vote for this is a vote against the competence and independence of your local law enforcement. And their choice, if the governor sends the military police in, will be to step aside.
Now, there is some confusion around this bill. An old federal law, the Posse Comitatus Act, bans federal troops from being used as police, but if the governor activates the Guard, they aren't federal troops. By giving these military police powers, they will be able to arrest people. The bill does say the governor should give reasonable warning to local police before deploying this military police unit, but doesn't specify what that would be. Dustin?
All right, Emily, thank you. Nikki, this is new for Indiana, but not all that unusual nationwide. In fact, the Minnesota National Guard has a similar force that was formed in 2020 after the riots in the Twin Cities. Also, the state police are already a police force that can be deployed here in the state, right?
Well, and I think that was the question from Democrats was why do we need this? And if you talk to the National Guard, I really think someone didn't do a good job explaining it, because they say, well, we already have these police units, but we have them in various of the units already existing in the National Guard, but we're just going to put them together. And then you got to go, well, then what's the point of the bill? And so the whole thing was just confusing how it was laid out. I don't think it was properly explained.
So the communication strategy was lacking.
Definitely.
Okay. All right, Nikki, thank you. Lawmakers are also looking to reform one of the state's most beleaguered agencies, the Department of Child Services, and that includes a bill inspired by tragedy. Emily?
Yeah, quite a tragedy, Dustin. It was just over 2 years ago that 5-year-old Kinsley Welty was found unresponsive in her Indianapolis home. Her mom's boyfriend, and grandmother were charged with neglect in her death, but her other family are also suing DCS, saying the agency should have done more to protect Kinsley. They say DCS prematurely closed 3 of 6 complaints against Kinsley's mom. Kinsley's family sent a note to lawmakers outlining how the agency could have saved her.
I am here today to tell you how many times DCS and the courts could have saved my granddaughter. These are details that you will not see in the short fatality report that the state publishes each year.
That was child welfare advocate Braylon Yerington reading that letter there. House Bill 1036 is a bipartisan bill that requires DCS to conduct an in-person assessment before closing an investigation into a credible abuse tip, and that has to be in person, that assessment with the alleged victim. The bill was authored by Democratic State Representative Victoria Garcia Wilburn. It received unanimous support in both chambers. Governor Braun signed it into law on Thursday. Dustin?
Emotional testimony for sure, Emily. Thank you. Nikki, this DCS is in a challenging position, right? It's one thing to mandate these visits, but we're also talking about an agency that is chronically overworked and understaffed.
Yeah, I mean, they have a turnover problem. It's obviously a very stressful position to be in. But I think it's important. I mean, the fact that they're dismissing complaints without actually checking them out is key. There was a separate bill also that would allow them to release some more information publicly. And I think that's important because a lot of times something will happen and all DCS says is we can't comment.
Yeah, talk about it, yeah.
And I don't think that's good for accountability. So there were sort of two ways to look at that.
Do you think there's going to be more reform down the road?
Gosh, I don't know how much more lawmakers can do. There was some frustration about parents who are using DCS basically to file complaints back and forth in custody or divorce cases. And so maybe there might be some appetite for like, look, if you keep filing these unsubstantiated reports to try to build a case, maybe there's something they could do there.
Okay. Well, that was not the only bill that saw strong bipartisan support this session. Another bill focused on a disease that certainly does not care about the part of the victims. That's for sure. We're talking about Alzheimer's disease, right, Emily?
Yeah, Dustin, we know that it's indiscriminate and cruel, and no one knows that better than House Bill 1029's author, State Representative Greg Porter, who wrote the bill in honor of his mother, Carmen. She died of the disease in 2024. Porter told me he wants to make sure Hoosiers are better equipped to tackle the disease, one that touches everyone.
And when individuals voted yes, they said this was for their grandmother, their mama, or whoever. So it is really Alzheimer's dementia doesn't look at people if they have an R, D, or I on their forehead. It hits everyone.
Under House Bill 1029, the Indiana Department of Health will cooperate with the National Alzheimer's Disease and Dementia Organization to create a program to educate Hoosiers about the disease. The bill will also allow the state to accept donations and grants from public and private entities to help it carry out that education mission. The bill was one of the first signed by Governor Braun on Tuesday. Dustin?
All right, Emily, thank you. Nikki, you and I have talked about the bipartisanship issue in the State House before. A lot of people think and hear, because it's often in the headlines, that there are partisan disputes. You got the Republicans over here, Democrats over here, but most bills are actually, as you pointed out, bipartisan in nature. Do you think that might change the public perception if more people knew about that?
Probably not, because the bills that are bipartisan are, and I'm not saying they're not important bills, but they're smaller bills. And so they don't have the massive impacts or the massive philosophical issues. So we are always going to have the huge bills be split. And, I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Well, all day we have been talking about what lawmakers got done in the 2026 session, but beyond redistricting, there have been a number of failures too. Emily, those include some long-term fights, huh?
Yeah, Dustin, it's pretty normal for many bills to fail in session. Many of them were never expected to make it very far, but they include some issues lawmakers have talked a lot about. That includes health care costs. We saw movement on how medical debt is collected, protecting Hoosiers from liens on their homes for hospital bills. It passed in the Senate, but never got a hearing in the House, and lawmakers did not take much action on the actual cost of health care. They also didn't do anything about cannabis in either direction. Republican leaders were always skeptical of any legalization measures, but a bill to regulate non-marijuana cannabis also failed, leaving open a loophole in the recent farm bill. And despite making moves on electricity bills, lawmakers didn't do anything about the industry many blame for the rising costs. Data centers. Several bills were introduced to tackle the issue, from water to power to land use, but lawmakers didn't move forward with any of them. This despite protests appearing at almost every data center project announced in the state. Lawmakers seem to content to put the pressure on the power companies, not their fastest growing customers. Dustin?
All right, Emily, great work as always this session at the State House. Thank you so much. Nikki, we'll get to the data center issue in a moment, but I wanted to ask you if there was anything else you were surprised to see fail this session.
There's a bill on hemp products that keeps failing on the first day. It happened again this year. They tried to put it in 3 different bills in the final week, and it would basically close a loophole on these Delta 8 products. And that continues to fail. It passes the Senate, and then the House just shuts it down. And so that's one that continues to fail, and I'm not really sure, given Republicans run both chambers, what it is that's stopping it.
Do you see more support session to session for the marijuana issue, either decriminalization or legalization, or do you think that this state is still a long way off before that happens?
I mean, we've seen it grow in recent years. There was like a period where it was gaining momentum. We even had some hearings, and then the last 2 years, it's like nothing again.
Okay.
And so I think we would need a full decriminalization on the federal level to see that go further.
Gotcha. All right. Well, still ahead here on Crossroads Politics, the U.S. continuing its attacks on Iran.
Combat operations continue at this time in full force.
The casualties on both sides as the fighting and the strikes continue. But first,
this issue is going to impact my kids and the kids they have and the kids they have. And these data centers are going to be living for a lot longer than I will or you will.
a lot of passion about this. Lawmakers fail to pass any bills dealing with the surge in data centers here in Indiana. We'll take you inside a people's hearing on the issue. It's next on Crossroads Politics. Welcome back. As we mentioned, lawmakers did not tackle data centers this session, and voters noticed. This week, Hoosiers turned out to talk about this trillion-dollar gold rush in our state. Nearly 200 people from across Indiana showed up in Indianapolis for the people's hearing on data centers. Ella Rhodes was there as voters demanded to be heard.
And I know that more is possible.
Inside a packed room at the Indiana State Library, people demanded lawmakers listen.
This issue is going to impact my kids and the kids they have and the kids they have. And these data centers are going to be living for a lot longer than I will or you will.
Hoosier Action held a hearing for data center bills, none of which they say got a hearing in the Indiana General Assembly.
This is an issue that we all deeply care about, and to show them that they can no longer ignore us.
Hoosiers on both sides of the aisle believe data centers threaten the quality of life, from water supply to energy costs.
We're living in a very tough time to raise a family, and in my mind, anything that makes it harder to raise a family, we shouldn't be giving them an inch.
Danielle Depke drove down from Fort Wayne for the hearing.
I think all of us are fighting for our lives and for the lives of future generations as well.
2 state senators plan to attend the people's hearing, but canceled due to session.
And I want to look at these representatives and just be like, do you not think that this is going to impact you too?
With the end of the legislative session on the horizon, the future for data center regulation doesn't look bright to these Hoosiers.
I think this is a really way to fight hopelessness, is coming together and doing something about it, rather than feeling like these things are being done to us.
You have to be accountable to us. You are elected to represent us, and this issue is not going away.
Nor their demands for lawmakers to hear their concerns. In Indianapolis, Ella Rhodes, 13 News.
Nikki, surprised it didn't make it to the table this year?
Not really. I mean, the fact is that Republican lawmakers and leaders, the governor, they support data centers.
Yeah, they say this is an economic boost for the,
yes,
for the state.
Not only just an economic boost, but they compare it to security for the nation as a whole. We need to control our own records and not have these centers in other countries. The irony is that the one thing they did do on data centers was require data centers to give some money to local communities to incentivize them.
Yeah. So what do you expect next session? More to come?
I don't see anything changing in the current view amongst leaders in the state.
All right. Thank you, Nikki. A bill now awaiting Governor Braun's signature could give families a stronger voice in reopening unsolved homicide cases. Our Alex Almanza looked into that. He talked with one family about their decades-long fight for justice and a potential new law they're helping to push across the finish line.
Sitting on shelves and inside filing cabinets around the state are a significant number of unsolved cases. Some have gone years or even decades without any new leads. Across Indiana, there are over 7,000 unsolved homicide cases, plus another 900 missing persons cases, some last seen as far back as the early 1970s.
That's where House Bill 1248 comes in, which would let families request advanced DNA testing in cold cases through approved nonprofits, with fundraising to help cover the cost. The bill's author, State Rep Carrie Hamilton, says it gives investigators new tools and families a better shot at justice.
It's truly a win-win for families and justice and our communities, making our communities safer.
HB 1248 is also being dubbed Carmen's Law. In 1993, 19-year-old Carmen Van Huss was killed in her Northwest Side apartment. For 30 years, no leads, no arrests. Until in 2024, when a man named Dana Shepard was arrested following DNA testing. It's this testing that Pam Francis, who grew up as Carmen's sister, says the family couldn't advance on their own.
We were also not allowed to pay for that testing, so our hands were tied. And that's what I really wanted to help change is how can we say, I understand it's cold, I understand we don't have the resources or the staffing or the funding, but what can families do to pursue their own justice so they don't have to wait as long as we did?
That's why Francis says she got in contact with Representative Hamilton, who helped her get Carmen's Law on the books at the State House.
But to be able to work on something like this together in a bipartisan way and with such a strong family backing the effort is, again, it's been a great process, and today getting to sign the bill was a very good day.
The bill now heads to the governor's desk with overwhelming support, with hopes that those earmarked dollars help solve cases that have gone cold for years. As for the tests, well, they can cost anywhere from $20,000 to $40,000 apiece. In Indianapolis, Alex Almanza, 13 News.
A lot of hope for those families. Francis says she's also helping promote a DNA 5K charity run this September to help raise money for DNA testing for Indiana cold cases. Well, this isn't the only effort to bring closure to cold cases across our state. Just last year, Indiana State Police became one of the first agencies in the country to hire a forensic genealogist. The position's focus, tracking DNA and family trees. And it's a position the State Police cold case team calls the biggest breakthrough in criminal investigations since the fingerprint and DNA itself. While traditional DNA testing compares evidence to possible suspects in a national criminal database, this position compares that DNA across genealogy databases accessible to police, using family trees and DNA to look for overlap and track down suspects. Police say a staggering 50% of cases are now solvable, they believe, using this technique. Gas prices surged just days after the president crows about affordability during his State of the Union.
Just hold on a little while. We're getting it down. And soon you will see numbers that few people would think were possible.
Let's say how Hoosiers are reacting to the speech and the latest in the attacks on Iran. Next on Crossroads Politics. Welcome back. Gas prices are already on the rise after the U.S. attack on Iran. Iran has closed the Strait of Hormuz, where almost 30% of the world's oil comes through. They also blew up the largest refinery in Saudi Arabia and forced Qatar to halt liquid natural gas production. Sharp increases in prices are possible as this conflict continues. Meanwhile, it all comes after the U.S. bombed Iran on Saturday, killing that nation's supreme leader. Alice Barr joins us from Washington after a briefing by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth.
This morning, the Pentagon confirming 3 U.S. Air Force fighter jets crashed in Kuwait, mistakenly shot down by Kuwaiti air defenses during active combat under Iranian attacks. All 6 American crew members ejected and were recovered safely. It comes amid growing violence in the Middle East, with Israel and Iranian-backed Hezbollah fighters in Lebanon exchanging fire, following this weekend's U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth weighing in.
This is not a so-called regime change war, but the regime sure did change, and the world is better off for it.
Lawmakers return to Washington tomorrow for the classified briefings many are demanding.
Combat operations continue at this time in full force.
Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed in the Saturday strikes, and now 2 sources briefed on the matter tell NBC News the attacks were timed based on intelligence Khamenei would be at a meeting with senior leaders. As Iran strikes back, now 4 American service members are confirmed killed in action. U.S. officials tell NBC News they were part of an army unit based in Kuwait. 4 others were seriously wounded. President Trump mourning the losses while warning.
Sadly, there will likely be more.
The president told NBC News in a phone interview he decided to act because Iran was unwilling to say they would not have a nuclear weapon following weeks of negotiations. Reaction from Capitol Hill largely split on party lines.
I think the president has
started a war of choice.
The mothership of terrorism is sinking.
Across this country, Iranian Americans hoping for freedom while protesters fear a spreading conflict. Lawmakers are expected to vote this week on a war powers resolution that would require President Trump to get approval from Congress before taking further military action. Democrats expect some Republicans to join them, acknowledging it would be a close vote that they say would send an enormous message. In Washington, Alice Barr, NBC News.
Lawmakers are weighing in on the conflict before their briefing set for Tuesday. Many Democrats, including Indiana Congressman Andre Carson, criticizing the move, saying it puts American troops in danger, while Republicans, including Indiana Senator Jim Banks, say it was necessary to make sure Iran did not get a nuclear weapon. He said in part, "I served in Afghanistan. I know what endless war looks like. This is not Afghanistan. This is the kind of decisive leadership that prevents another Afghanistan." All of this comes on the heels of the first State of the Union speech, I should say, of President Trump's second term. He used the speech to highlight what he called the successes of his first year. That includes his immigration crackdown, falling inflation, and tariffs. The Supreme Court had just struck down many of his tariffs, sparking a wave of new tariffs on all trade.
I used these tariffs, took in hundreds of billions of dollars to make great deals for our country, both economically and on a national security basis. Everything was working well.
The administration told courts it could easily refund the tariff money if struck down, but has since backtracked. This past week, President Trump delivered his first State of the Union of his second term, and during that speech, he declared America is back. But new polling shows a majority of Americans disapprove of his handling when it comes to the economy. We sent our Jenna Webster downtown to talk with Hoosiers for their opinion on the speech.
Here on Monument Circle, the majority of people did not watch the State of the Union last night. They say they either didn't want to, they had other plans, they didn't know what was on. But when we asked them what they would like the White House to focus on in the next year before the next State of the Union, the number one thing that kept coming up, affordability.
I don't even pay attention. It's too depressing.
While many chose not to watch, it didn't stop Hoosiers from sharing their opinion on the current State of the Union. Is there anything that you'd like to see the administration focus on in the next year?
The people.
Why is that?
Because we have a lot of things where we're having to pay a lot more money than we used to.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
During his speech, the president boasted a stronger economy, declaring prices are coming down.
You see it with gas, you see it with some of the groceries, but overall, it could be better.
Everything is more and more expensive. It doesn't feel affordable.
To the extent he acknowledged high costs and inflation, Trump blamed Democrats.
I feel like there's an enormous lack of that sort of accountability in Washington right now. It's their fault, it's their fault, it's their fault.
Michael Wilson isn't the only one on Monument Circle who's tired of the politics, but he does like the president's new tax deduction policy for overtime.
We could stop with letting rich people that are in our government stock trade.
Angela Lamble agrees with his call to stop members of Congress from doing just that. Trump also announced he wants tech companies to build their own power plants for the data centers. Lamble says it's a great idea, but isn't sure it's feasible.
I think it's just two sides that are not coming together to make America better.
Here on Monument Circle, Hoosiers want to see policies directly helping them and say both sides of the aisle need to be part of that discussion. In Indianapolis, Jenna Webster, 13 News.
Jenna tells us several people also told her they'd like to see more of a focus on domestic policies instead of foreign affairs. And that does it for this week's episode of Crossroads Politics. We want to give a special thanks to photojournalist Chris Webb. Without him, our coverage of this year's legislative session would have been impossible. I mean, quite literally, we wouldn't have seen it. So for Chris, Emily, Nikki, Jenna, Alex, and all of us here at 13 News, thank you so much for watching. We hope to see you next time.